Richie, I'm super excited today that on Chai we are going to have Dr. Justin Norden, who is heading up teaching the first ever generative AI course at Stanford Medicine. And he just put out the first ever collaborative state of healthcare generative AI and AI space report, which we will be sure to link in the comments for our viewers. But after being a startup founder working in enterprise, he's now working in the VC space. So it's going to be a great conversation, and I think we're going to talk about trust.
Yeah, he's got the full gamut. He's been in startups, he's been in the enterprise, he's deploying capital, he's in academia. Kind of fits the same model that you and I tend to gravitate towards. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. As usual, he has no idea what questions we're going to ask him, and so this is going to be quite the ride. All right, let's get into the show. Welcome to Chai. So Justin, you started a company called Trustworthy AI. This was way before we all saw AI kind of meet human level participation. So there must have been some insight, some foresight that went into the naming of the company for you to hone in on trust. What was that foresight or insight way beyond the rest of us seeing where AI is today?
Absolutely. So when we were starting Trustworthy AI, we saw the disconnect between we're starting to see AI in our consumer products. Maybe it's serving us ads in some way. Maybe it's doing these, pretty simple, non-risky tasks. But it was going to be pretty different as we were going to move towards AI in safety critical settings. It's simple to serve an ad, design a little chatbot. It's another thing if we're driving a car, delivering healthcare, moving into these safety critical domains.
Yeah.
So that was the genesis behind naming of the company Trustworthy AI, which funny enough we ended up trademarking, and actually Waymo actually owns those rights today, despite the fact that people are using this word left, right, and center in today's conversations. But that was the genesis, which, we need to think about AI differently. We need to think about testing AI differently if we're going to deploy it in these settings that the stakes are higher.
Yeah. So our thoughts here is that trust is the center of gravity on AI, and that's what we're gonna kind of hone in our discussions on here. Trust is big. And everything that we do today requires trust. Every transaction, every human, every transaction. As a matter of fact, commerce wouldn't happen unless we all trusted each other. If everybody had to have a contract and read every contract, commerce would come to a crashing halt, right? Safety is interesting, for sure. But trust has something to do with being able to understand something or believe in something that you can't understand. If we think about neural networks, there's a whole bunch of hidden layers in the middle, kind of like a black box. Nobody's going to understand that black box. Even if we were to build it in this beautiful 3D model of visualization, the human brain's just not going to get there. So what are your thoughts on how do we get to a point where the consumer is going to blindly go, I don't understand what's going on in there, but I'm going to trust it?
It's such a good question, and trust has so many different meanings to different people. So let's disentangle a few different aspects of trust and how we eventually get to consumer understanding of it. Let's start with the basics. As we're developing, how do we develop trust? We start with understanding what's safe and not safe from the world around us. We're experiencing that, and then leaning on others who we already trust in our network, who somewhat lend that credibility to say, hey, this is trusted, not trusted, this person, entity, organization, etc. So one aspect of trust that I think a lot of technologists overlook is this social aspect. But we tend to not overlook this in medicine, right? When we think about, our journals, our practice, our peers who we respect the most, a lot of what is done is still based on a mentorship approach and our apprenticeship through residency and training, where we learn trusted techniques and paths from mentors, colleagues, our peers who we think are at the top of our game. And so there's this social element of trust, which is one layer I want to call out, that as these AI systems are getting in the public mind, in the public consciousness, people are starting to see it more. We need to make sure, all of us are doing a good job to kind of educate people on trust, start to say, what things or better uses for AI and safer uses of AI and things that we think aren't okay. So that one component is social, I want to call out. But then there's a lot of technical layers and things we can do to improve trust. Yes, okay, one version is, hey, it's a black box, you just have to trust everything, but it's more nuanced than that. As we can start to test black box algorithms. Part of what we were doing actually at our papers before that we published at places like NeurIPS was, how do we understand what's happening in a black box? How do we test what's happening in a black box so we can have a measure of performance, a measure of reliability for what these algorithms are doing, and not simply blindly trust that we just take for at face value that is doing the job. And so, there's all the way from the social components of trust all the way to, actual, using, AI and other techniques to measure other AI systems to understand, reliability and performance better.
Yep.
I think you've sort of provocatively suggested through your work in the public domain that consumer trust is really what's going to hold AI back, especially in domains like healthcare. But I wonder whether or not you think that consumers are really going to just go right along with this. Like we've seen, for example, right, that people are just picking up GPT and other things, and they're willing to blindly trust what comes back. And I did a fun exercise last night where I was sort of doing some prep for different meetings, and Richie showed up on a list, an AI list, as referenced in an article, and I knew he wasn't in the article. And I said, "Oh, can you tell me what page that was on?" And I was like, "Oh, of course, Richie actually wasn't." So I said, "Well, can you tell me more about Richie?" And it told me some really interesting things about Richie and some really interesting things about me that weren't true. So I worry a little bit about us actually trusting too much. What do you think about that?
It's a really good point, and I think with the general nature of these new models, ChatGPT, other large language models we're playing with, how they've been trained, being designed to try to give us what we want, we're certainly seeing, just like you mentioned, lots of failures where it tries to do something, produces something that isn't real, the hallucinations people are talking about, and then losing trust with the user, saying, "Hey, wait a second, this isn't right." And I have this conversation with countless people now. I do polls, whether it's in class or at meetings with large healthcare systems, where you say who's used ChatGPT, and maybe 50-60% of the hands will go up. Who uses it on a weekly basis? Most of them drop. Right. And I think one issue is as we launched these consumer applications, they tried it a few times. It wrote an amazing poem, and then they tried to ask some specific piece of information, and it got it wrong. And they said, "Whatever, not ready for prime time. I don't trust it." Interestingly, from my perspective, kind of as a super user, someone who's built different systems and things like this, you have to understand what the models can do well and what they can't do well, and learn how to use it. Just like we learned how to use Google search back in the day. It's not that the first result was perfect every time. We knew exactly how to search for keywords. That same process has to happen as we learn to use LLMs and foundation models in our daily lives. And because of the pace of movement, these companies skipped a few steps to kind of really build up that trust and make that happen. And we can go for why that happened, which as companies are racing, people tend to skip steps. So we need to rebuild that consumer trust, and we need to rebuild how people are using these models, how they should check the outputs of these models, different techniques like retrieval augmented generation that can improve the fidelity of the output and ground it in real information. So there are lots of people working on all these aspects of things, but it wasn't all there from day one, which describes those issues that you're talking about.
Yeah. The arms race got started. Let's check you. So we always check on this show to figure out where people are on what we call the opinion spectrum. Okay, so obviously like every invention that's ever come across, whether it was motors or fire or electricity, there's always alarmists to evangelists. Where do you most find yourself on this spectrum? Because I think it's fair enough to be all across the board, but where do you find yourself mostly?
I'll put myself in the evangelist and or optimist category. While there are issues and limitations, at least for healthcare, where I focus, I spend time on the AI side to understand what's happening. Most of my time is for how this is going to impact patient care, hospital operations, and the healthcare system. We're there in terms of performance to be able to start tackling and taking off the plate so many mundane tasks, repeatable operations, and things in healthcare today. Forget GPT-5, forget new models. If we just focused on, implementing safely, GPT-4 and other like capabilities, we're there to fundamentally change what healthcare looks like. And so that's where I'll put myself in the evangelist camp.
Yeah, we tend to hang out around the realist optimist camp. The show nets out around there.
Perfect.
We have
I'm
different.
With you. I'm on the evangelist end.
Yeah, I like to bring up the alarmist conversations because I feel like first of all, if we were having this quality of discussion on this spectrum about the internet, think about some of the unintended consequences that we might have been able to avoid. So being here today and having these conversations sort of on day zero kind of helps us, hopefully avoid some of the unintended consequences. This show is called Chai. This is our chai, with having chai and drinking. The ecosystem is starting to look like this. There is hardware players in the ecosystem. The cloud players are obviously playing their hyperscalers and native cloud. There's obviously all the models that are coming out now. There's more models than people expected because we didn't know they were there, and now we're all seeing them. Marketplaces are starting to exist. I saw a big deal with Hugging Face and NVIDIA just the other day. I consider the popular LLMs apps, and so I think about them as packaged for consumption. And then there's all the service providers. If you think about the Deloittes, the Accentures, the IBMs, and everyone that will provide service in between. On the right-hand side of this are other things. On the left-hand side might be regulations. So we think about the marketplace like this. Trust in healthcare. Healthcare is one of those areas where you can't get something wrong. The only other area that might be most critical is in self-driving right now, if we think about AI, right?
Right.
Where do you think the opportunity is in this ecosystem to be able to bring players to this conversation to say, hey man, we got to work together on this trust thing? Is it the instrumentation in the cloud to be able to capture all the training data, to be able to then drive that to some transparency? Is it the marketplaces to facilitate the ratings that are coming out of sort of fine-tuning or back propagation? Where do you see opportunities in this ecosystem to talk to groups of people or companies about trust?
I like the framework that you've demonstrated here, and again, especially let's call it outside of healthcare, we're seeing so many companies in each of these domains. Focusing on healthcare, let's start where I don't see kind of the biggest opportunities. So model development today, there are, I think, as you mentioned, far more models and new ones popping up by the day. In healthcare and outside of healthcare. Now we're starting to see, each individual, healthcare institution build its own model on its own EHR data. We're seeing startups raise tens of millions of dollars to try to create healthcare specific models. And while I'm happy that research is happening, I actually don't think that's the right place for a startup to compete today. And here's why. The performance, and granted, this is still a tough question for how we really truly should be measuring performance, but let's call it, question answering, which is one of the ways that we've been seeing people measure performance in these algorithms. GPT-4, forget fine tuning, is still blowing these other models out of the water.
Yep.
Including, MedPalm 2, Google, not just some little startup trying to do a healthcare specific model. I don't think these today, spending tens of millions of VC dollars on a healthcare specific model is actually a good use of compute, is a good use of money. When I think of healthcare AI, I think of it as an applied field. we're taking what works elsewhere, we're putting specific healthcare guardrails and infrastructure, deployment use cases around where it needs to be in healthcare. Usually we're not creating fundamental advances in AI specifically in healthcare. Let others do that. And so for healthcare, I'm more interested in people who are doing the tough work of integration and actually building applications. And so lots of people are working in the app space for healthcare. That's where we're seeing the most healthcare AI companies start. Unfortunately, the thing I'm still missing is they're going after such niche specific use cases, and that's not how typical healthcare purchasers want to buy. If you're trying to sell to a health system, they do not want another narrow point solution. They don't want another thing that they have to, go through integration with security and compliance for, some tiny LLM use case that is more or less, the word that people like, a thin wrapper, right, on an API. It's actually far easier today to build a new application than it is to test it, understand model performance, and how it should be used. And so I think what is going to be interesting is some version of both services, apps, marketplaces, platform that package far more together is what I've been really excited about looking in healthcare. Because each marginal use case, once you've done integration, deployment, figured out testing, it's pretty easy to get out there. So I think it's kind of bundling. I want to bundle a lot of these buckets that I think is the really big healthcare opportunity. And in terms of hardware and cloud, that's enough architecture that probably can last and that we can take from somewhere else. For healthcare specifically, I want to bundle a number of elements on the right.
You hit on a point around the thin wrapper. So we've done some work, and I do some advisory stuff, and the thing that I notice is that it's very hard for people to draw the line between am I a consumer of AI or am I a producer of AI? And so a lot of people are like, oh, we're working with the large language models, and as a result we're doing AI. That's like saying in the early internet days, because I'm really good at AOL, I'm doing the internet. Right. That's just not it. And I do believe that, and even if you take a portfolio view from a venture perspective, most of the value is still going to come from the producers of AI. Yes, there's going to be some runaway apps that consume existing commoditized models that kind of outperform the rest of the world, like how Amazon kind of like just took the basic internet and outperformed everybody. And that's a business model play and a design play. But I feel like there's still a lot of work to be done, or still a lot of things that will come from producing actual models, actual learnings. This is a 10K. I think it was Adam from AWS that said like we're three steps into a 10K run. Data sets in healthcare represent probably 5K of that 10K run. And it's going to require really new foundational training. And I don't mean to conflate it with foundational models, but real hard work to be done in the ecosystem, which kind of bifurcates those who can play from those who can't play because of the cost and the barrier of entry to train. What kind of rearrangement of ecosystem incentives would you want to introduce to your students, or from an investment perspective, to say, here's how we rearrange capital and incentives so that we can actually garner the investments to go after, this subset of data in healthcare?
Wow, lot to unpack there. Let's see. So, yes, there will be lots of specific healthcare data that we need to figure out how to utilize correctly. So let me start there. And that's one of the reasons I think all of us are so excited about these new types of models in healthcare, because the statistic people like to throw out is roughly 70% of data, if not more, in healthcare is unstructured. Imaging, notes, etc. Now we can use embeddings to structure this. We can pull out structured data. It's organized in a different way. We can match imaging content to notes, to structured fields. And so what's really exciting from a pure kind of academic perspective is the amount of research and understanding where we've kind of had a very limited look at what data is actually being produced by healthcare now we have fundamentally new ways to access that data and develop and build new insights from that. So like that's one perspective on that data. The next perspective you're asking about is like how that starts to change our business models and incentives from healthcare. And this, I wish I had a perfectly clear answer for you. For students, this is the company to go build. Everyone else, investors get behind. But maybe I'll start by this, looking backwards from moment healthcare. Healthcare data, really came to be seen as, has been sold for forever. There's been these, tough challenges of, well, does the patient own the data? Does the hospital own the data? Is pharma's buying it? In either case, data has been packaged in different ways, de-identified, I'll say in quotes, for years and years and decades of people buying this data to make better decisions. One of the kind of prominent use cases was when Flatiron sold to Roche for a couple $2 billion.
Yep.
And this was a kind of flag for venture and otherwise of, wow, this data could be very valuable, as well as to providers of, wait a second, we got none of that.
Right.
We were giving up all this data for free in turn for the use of the EMR, and we didn't capture any of that value. And so after that, there was a lot of, fear isn't the right word, but now, wait a second, our data is valuable, so we're going to put guardrails behind it and say with other companies, what you can and can't do with it. Other companies like Triveta have spun up to say, healthcare institutions, we're going to guard our data and profit off our own data rather than someone else doing it. And so data has had this kind of interesting, interesting flavors as people have kind of viewed data and its value in healthcare over the years. Now with these kind of new models, there's yet another kind of layer of interest for what is this data? What is the data we have today worth, as well as what is the data we're going to generate as we're using these models going forwards? And so I want to be balanced on kind of the value of just EHR data today. If you talk to providers, you get into the details. A lot of people like to say garbage in, garbage out. EMR data is bloated. It has lots of things that were copy pasted before, that were incorrect, that were there for billing. So there is a lot of the data that is useful for decision-making, clinical decision support, building high quality models. There's also a lot of crap. One thing that I think is very interesting is as we have higher fidelity ways to generate this data and start to build bigger pieces of it, we're starting to see more and more video visits where you can have perfect audio transcripts corresponding to that, as well as the billing codes that were coming out the other end, the clinical decisions that were being made. People who are starting to capture actual understanding of what's going on in the clinical visit, where the diagnostic is happening, what the outcome was later, and build really high quality data sets, I think is very exciting. Yeah. So there's the state of where data is today, which we can build models on, will certainly be valuable, and people are starting to do that. There's then the state of, as we gather high fidelity data, what are we going to be able to do next? That I think there's lots of opportunity on.
Yeah, I think the large language models broke the garbage in, garbage out kind of promise, because in some ways it was garbage in, and it's not necessarily garbage out. And so I'm very excited about this capacity to now be able to filter the garbage. It's almost like a garbage data recycling program now, right? We're going to throw plastic in, right, and get something amazing out. What I was curious about and where I was going with the question is, I've always been interested in, and we should have another conversation about privacy and data ownership and zero-party data another day. I've always been interested in breaking the math on data. A lot of work goes into, look, I'm going to look at blank type of data and I'm going to get blank type of output and insight in there. What I found is when you mix adjacent data sets, you barely get any increase. But when you mix orthogonal data sets together, especially unstructured orthogonal data sets together, that's when you break the math. That's when 1 + 1 = 3 or 1 + 1 = 4. And so in the arms race that we're seeing, in this sort of everybody's trying to figure out, how can I build intelligence in this arms race? This is where I think partnerships, unusual partnerships, are going to be start to shaping around data itself, where you may see people that traditionally would not partner in the marketplace that now recognize that. Are there any two interesting data sets in healthcare and something that you're passionate about, where you would go, man, if we could bring this data set and that data set together, I know normally we don't, but now that we have this new machinery, wow, I wonder if we can do that. And I want you to draw from your provider experience. I know you're a physician yourself. My wife is a provider as well. Like, what's something that really gets you excited where 1 + 1 equals more than 2?
Yeah, the example that comes to mind, first is as we can get out from clinical notes or other piece of information, the social determinants of health, we can finally bring that into clinical encounters, to the point of care where we're making decisions, and now make the right decisions that will fit the patients, their needs, and their abilities to actually carry out that task. The reason that's so important is most of someone's health outcomes, as much as we like to try to have big egos in medicine, are not driven by the provider. It's their environment, and it's the situation that they're in. And for so long, and again, it depends on the provider, but for so long, medicine has said, well, I gave you the right answer. You just didn't do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So your fault, not my fault. So the patient was non-compliant with the suggested treatment. But that's not good enough. And as we start to move towards these better models of care, as we eventually want to start to get towards value, taking down that barrier of just what happens in the actual visit in the clinical encounter to what is happening in the home environment, what is happening in terms of someone's social situation, where they live, what they're capable of, let alone add in remote patient monitoring, vitals, and other objective data coming in, clinical data coming in from those in between visit categories. We're now going to start to have a completely different aspect of healthcare. And so specifically the data sets around social determinants of health, what is happening outside the clinical walls, and being able to bring, as you mentioned, what historically has been kind of too much data, no way to organize it, kind of unclear which pieces to act on, to these are the actionable elements now that an LLM can summarize in an actual clinical encounter, to start to actually change and reach into what was historically ignored is a little bit too strong, but in some cases just overlooked area where we know if we intervene correctly, we can change patient outcomes. So that's just one data set as an example where we're starting to see.
I want to bring it back to trust, because I think whether another large language model is ever done or not wouldn't matter. The attention and investment and capital that's been put into AI is going to drive the industry forward, right? My back of the napkin estimate is about $1 trillion has been invested net new in AI this year between VC, PE, government, and large organizations that are putting things in, right? All the big fours, all the big consulting companies are doing multi-billion-dollar investments in it. So we're going to advance this agenda, no question. Regardless of whether there's ever another large language model or not. Trust comes down to trust but verify. In many cases, historically, that's been our thing. And AI is going to be so proliferated in everything that we do. And I'm fast forwarding 20 years out. I think 2 years is kind of like silly. Like yes, the world's not going to change. 10 probably, but 20 is going to be when we look back 20 years from now, we'll go, wow, Justin, Angela, and Richie, we really didn't see what was coming, right? Yeah. I look at it and I say, okay, how do we establish trust today? And one of the ways that we establish trust today is, let's just think about, and this goes back to Angela, work I just did with Vala Afshar from Salesforce, a FICO score for every AI model. Right, something that allows a consumer to very easily, very simply go, so I guess I could trust this AI versus I can't trust that AI. And that's going to require more about the data than about the model. Because the model can be instrumented, it's sort of something that you can document, you can understand, but data keeps flowing all the time. And when we think about where this thing goes, we think about data mastery as one of the jobs that we need to figure out. And you talked a little bit about data readiness and stuff like that. We think about model maturity, and then we think about cultural readiness. From a data mastery standpoint, my concern here, and we've had this discussion before, is we need to figure out what is going into the model in the first place.
Yeah.
It's very hard to say this data set is good enough to go through a model, and as a result, we can trust it. How do we start to think about trust in the data? Because we're talking a lot about trust in the model. I think that part we're going to solve, right? We're going to instrument the models through that supply chain that we just went through. Auditors are going to start auditing models. There's going to be scoring systems. I call it the coexistence score, like could AI and humans coexist? But trust in data is not something that we've been good at historically. Any thoughts on what has to change in technology for us to be able to trust data?
I agree with you. We're getting better at model maturity and starting to think about testing there. Not that it's solved in any means, and it's domain specific, likely for ways to do that.
Yeah.
Is it a technology problem to figure out data mastery? I'm not sure I agree. I think we're starting to see regulators play in on, people have these, we need the ingredients list,
Yep.
right? For the AI model, where the data came from, what's happening, and we're seeing OpenAI in particular, at the center of lots of these discussion friction around, wait a second, do we have to disclose every piece of data? We're starting to see on the data mastery side, OpenAI saying, hey, actually, oops, we've been scraping all of your data for a while now, but here's a way to opt out of this. Is it a technology problem to figure out data mastery?
Well, let's look at it from a social.
I would argue it's more a regulatory question of what are we demanding, both from consumers and ultimately regulators saying we're requiring from these.
Yeah. Ange and I had the pleasure and painful experience of reading the EU AI Act before we started Chai. So lots of coffee, by the way, to be able to stay through it. It's watching parking meters expire is more interesting. One of the things that the EU AI Act does, just like GDPR kind of set a North Star, is it talks so much about the model and very little about the data. The data conversation ends up being a conversation about bias, a conversation about inclusion, a conversation about sometimes trust, sometimes responsibility, etc. There is a bit of a paradox there, which is if we have to put all data in to make sure that we represent all points of views, we are essentially reflecting the entire aggregate of humanity into AI. In some ways, we're giving birth to this thing as a species, as a unit of one. And much like raising kids, I don't know if you have kids, there's a little bit of like a do as I say, not do as I do, right? With AI, there's no do as I say, there's only do as I do, because if we're just going to pop our exhaust into it, it's going to bring every bad behavior, right? Every good behavior as well. There could be a bias for negative information, because that's kind of what people tend to perpetuate. What do they say? A lie makes it around the world before the truth gets its laces tied. That's kind of what I'm curious about, right? If you just take everything and you throw it in there, and there's a lot of commercial interest in just throwing more data in there. Let's just put everything in because we're going to get a better outcome, a smarter model. That's where I think we got to be thoughtful and careful. I probed you. It's an unfair question on that. Nobody knows the answer, right? I was looking kind of 20 years out. But I think that's where the opportunity is to start to mature the conversation, to looking at the practices, the model, the data, the rights, the inclusion, the bias, and everything else. Let's switch to a VC. So I know you're involved in a venture. One of the challenges, I think, with capital deployment is that you kind of miss the opportunity to catch the edges of the bell curve, and you kind of invest in geographies that or kind of communities that and that makes sense, right? Same reason why you hang out with the friends that AI is very different from the rest of big inventions that's come about. I'll give you an example, like electricity. I grew up in South America. We didn't have electricity in South America until about 50 years after it was in Europe. So there was like a time lag between when the big invention got from the center of gravity of the world to the edges. AI, everyone's in on day zero. If you've got an internet connection and a computer and a credit card, you can get on AWS and start training models. And so that opens the playing field. now for ventures, for investment, for capital. And then in addition to that, everybody's sort of like in the 101 class, right? It's kind of like a day zero for everyone. There's like 1% of the world that is qualified to go into the 102 class that actually understands, the statistical, sophisticated mathematics that goes into it. How do you think about that from a capital deployment perspective now? Now that the global reach is almost to the edge of the 4 billion people that are connected to the internet, and everyone's on day zero. You could argue that Austin, the Valley, certain aspects in Europe, and maybe New York City and Boston are ahead a little bit, but everybody else is going into the 101 class. How does that make you think from a capital deployment perspective?
It's a really good point. So I'll start with the parts I agree with, and then I'll throw some wrinkles at you. So I agree with you. The whole world, at once is going through this re-education of even the people at that 1% figuring out these things. Like people were starting there, but no one quite realized how fast and how much all of this would take the world by storm. One of my favorite examples is we had a symposium at Stanford back in May. We had the chief scientific officer at Microsoft there, our head of data science at Stanford, a head of digital health from the FDA, and so on and so on. And I've never seen a panel say, flinch at the question of what's coming next. Let's go a year out, 2 years out. You experts love to give perfect predictions and talk all that. I've never seen people be, we don't know. And so that's where I'll agree with you. Education and people are all grasping, and then just the open source, launches every week, for what's happening. People are iterating. It's happening really fast. The challenge from a capital deployment perspective now is these models are almost so ubiquitous and things are moving so fast. It's been a challenge for a lot of people to say, and where are the moats? Where are the businesses to capture the value of this technology when, yes, we've made a bunch of old businesses obsolete. We're starting to see, especially in education, right? That was one of the first areas where, ChatGPT took down, public companies, around tutoring. And, we're going to see more of this where, hey, now it's trivial, right, to create a tutoring chatbot to go through something and, create writing tools. Even the AI companies that grew really quickly are now falling and laying off people because it's almost too easy to develop a competitor to that. And so while I agree with you that, the whole world is building applications now, and, someone had a quote that I can't verify this, but saying, there's like 7,000, new AI startups that were already started, in San Francisco alone, where that's where I would kind of push back and some say there are niduses where even though the world is kind of experiencing AI in these models, there's so many more people, again, it's our bias and, in backyard, there's so many more people in the Bay Area focused on this and are at least a little bit ahead and starting to ask, what is that, 102 level question? What are those next questions? And as a venture investor, I think we have to be playing that game. Otherwise, you're going to be chasing things that are going to be a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
You're investing in the consumers, not the producers at that point.
Exactly. And you need to kind of see where these things are going. Otherwise, we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job to say kind of where are the huge, simple, groundbreaking businesses that will form from this technology. And that part within healthcare, where I spend the most time, actually has been really challenging, where a lot of the fundamental kind of AI engineers and people building the new tools and trying to play on that 102 level game are choosing not to work in healthcare. Healthcare is too hard, regulations too unclear. We're not going to do that. And so they're working elsewhere, which makes sense. And I don't blame them for that, because healthcare is harder and it is slower. And healthcare won't be the first place where we deploy all these AI tools. We're going to take the learnings from the regulation and all the challenges that we've seen in the autonomous vehicle space that you mentioned before we start to see those kind of real groundbreaking companies come out in healthcare. And so, yes, the kind of whole world is educating and deploying. I would argue we're still a few steps ahead in the Bay Area, just in terms of how many AI meetups and people building and testing, or a student in class comes and says, hey, Justin, I built this in the afternoon. What do you think? The augmented reality, a student who built the real-time speech to text, augmented reality glasses. I don't know if you saw his TikTok video that went viral. doing this. You know, we're still a little bit ahead in the area. And if you look at the investment dollars, it's following suit. Most of the investment dollars, if you look at the data, is still focused on the Bay Area. And so while it could be this giant equalizer, we haven't seen that as much yet from an investment perspective.
Yeah. I do some work in the other parts of the world. I would say the Caribbean, for example. There's so much talent in the Caribbean and South America that have been sort of under the radar. It'll be interesting to see the source of the big wins, so to speak. Where do the big wins come? We can't tell. We'll know in 10, 20 years, right? There's probably, I'm going to say, $10 trillion companies in 20 years that haven't been incorporated as yet, that are about to come. Let's shift the conversation. Ange and I think you've worked in enterprise as well, right? So I'd consider Apple a large enterprise. Ange is a BMS. By full disclosure, I was at IQVIA, which is a large healthcare data provider in a previous career, or a previous genre of my career. The enterprises stand in an interesting posture now. One is they've got the resources to invest, which is in the past the barrier to entry was low. So startups could have a good jump start. Two is in the enterprise, most executives in the enterprise are a little better at change and courage than they were through the internet. And that's because a lot of executives have gone through a digital transformation. So they're still not change agents and entrepreneurs, but playbook one is not going to work. There's a little bit more change appetite in the large enterprise. But with the large enterprise, there's something to lose, right? And this is what I would argue is the difference between Google and OpenAI. OpenAI was willing to put out a product, whereas Google didn't want to put it out because they didn't want to take the risk of what could happen from it, right? It's a risk game that started the arms race. Enterprises, there is the Enron of AI that is coming. We just don't know who it's going to happen to.
But you're going to say Theranos.
Right, but someone's going to make a big mistake. Some enterprise is going to make a big mistake with AI. And trust, it's going to come back down to trust, because those mistakes are going to damage trust. And we're moving to a world where trust is becoming sort of a board level conversation, right? Not just sustainability, not just diversity and inclusion, but trust is now sort of that three-legged stool in there. And AI adds fire to trust at the same time, right? I'm curious about your thoughts around, from an enterprise perspective, how do enterprises get ahead of this desire to go out and do it because it's there and we can pilot it, but at the same time be responsible to go, I have to slow down. I don't have to do it just because my competitor is doing it, because the price of having the Enron of AI is too high. Like, where would you advise executives? Like, how would you start to say, hey man, listen, you got to think harder here?
This is a conversation I've been having again with health systems and healthcare players now for the past few months. It's also people who knew me previously, people who didn't know me, who saw me talk somewhere and say, hey, can you come speak to us about what are we going to do with this healthcare AI? Because on the one hand, they see all these amazing applications. Maybe their kid at home showed them on their homework what it's capable of, and on the other hand, they're, especially in healthcare, again, we're still dealing with faxes. Nothing is automated. Our IT system is stuck in the 90s for all practical purposes. And so they see this disconnect and say, okay, how do we jump from point A to point B? And it is exactly this question of trust that is the blocker. And I like to say, historically, to update the IT stack, there was these AI models kept over promising and then under delivering, right? Watson, the big example in healthcare, where AI reached way too far before what it was capable of, and then also lost and eroded whatever trust and goodwill that had been there. And so now I'd say, in general, there's a pretty high level of skepticism from all these big enterprises in healthcare, and a gap to how do we rebuild that trust so we can start to deploy it. The way I'm talking with enterprises about it is you still need to be proactive, because there's a bunch of healthcare systems right now that are saying, generative AI, I don't understand this, I'm just going to ban it. Ban everything, which is kind of, putting your hands over your eyes and saying, if I can't see it, it's not doing anything. Most workers, and we're starting to see these polls, 40, 50% now it's changing of workers using, ChatGPT or other, AI tools at work, 70% not telling their bosses about it. I don't have healthcare specific numbers, but people are going to use these tools. I think, Rishi mentioned, we can't put it back now. It's here, it's going to develop the $1 trillion, et cetera, going in, so we can't put it away. And so systems really have to be proactive to start building these policies, one, about kind of how we want to allow people to use these tools, put guardrails around these tools, and then two, start learning from the early use cases. It's not that you can put your hands over your eyes, wait 3 years, and then deploy it perfectly when you go out later. It's no, we need to start with the lower risk use cases where even if it goes wrong, it doesn't end up in an Enron-like situation. But in healthcare, let's start with the administrative use cases first. Let's start with the things that the FDA is not going to touch, that they're lower risk to start, whether it's thinking through notes, coding and billing, just understanding our own data for operations better, where even as it goes wrong, we can start to put those guardrails in place. As the research in general in the field starts to move, we understand what those guardrails are that need to be put in place. We can start to build those as we kind of keep marching along towards, these dream use cases or higher risk use cases where the AI probably could play a role today, but we don't know exactly how it's going to interact. Yeah. And so that's been my message to enterprises is you need to be proactive about this today. One, or, you can just try to avoid it. This is the kind of the most transformational technology I think that we've seen in decades, and all of us on this call believe that. And so you have to start building a proactive approach to how you're going to put the guardrails in place, the platforms you need to start deploying these technologies.
Yep. Ange and I.
So many insights today. So many insights. I just want to be cognizant of time, Justin. I know we had you till 3:15. We're a minute over, or whatever time that is for you in Pacific. So before I let Richie close us, I just want to make sure you've got another 2 or 3 minutes for us.
I'm all set on my end, so I can go over. I know I was a few minutes late too, so I apologize for that.
No worries. All right, sorry to break your stride there, Rich, but I wanted to make sure that we were respectful of the time frame.
Yeah, it's a talent game. Winning here is a talent game. It's for the enterprise. I think Ange and I have had conversations about this. This is where your service providers, your strategy advisors, your talent augmentation companies, this is where they become much more important here. I do think that the enterprises can kind of de-risk themselves from the Gartner hype chart, the trough of disillusion. Like, you could flatten the trough, right? And you don't have to go all the way to the bottom, because we're going through it for the second time. I want to bring this full circle into closing and go back to our opinion spectrum. I know you said you're an evangelist, and so we hang out on that side of the spectrum. What's your favorite alarmist use case? Like, what's the one where you're like, man, I love to tell this alarmist story if I had one?
Favorite alarmist use case? Well, the one I brought up in class, that was pretty alarming. In fact, when I was texted by a friend, hey, check out this alarmist use case, I thought it was a joke. I thought there's no way it could be real. And so my favorite alarmist use case in healthcare that just gets people's wheels turning is full-fledged chatbot, GPT-enabled diagnosis. You give me your symptoms, you give me your vitals, and I will just give you back a diagnosis for, I don't know, $20 a month. And it's none other than Martin Shkreli, who launched this a number of months ago, AKA Pharma Bro, who went to jail with drug prices and things like that. And this is the alarmist use case I like to call out, because on the one hand, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this is done. Intended use, it shouldn't be legal. There should be a crackdown. He's putting all sorts of disclaimers saying this is not medical advice, and then giving medical advice for what needs to be done. And yet my hope is that it starts to just drive the conversation forward faster with regulators and everyone else saying, wake up, we have to do something about this. Because also, if you push me and say, again, I haven't gone into detail, I haven't done the performance testing on his system, but if you just did GPT-4 full automated diagnostics today, is it going to get things wrong? Yes, of course. Is it going to get things right far more often? Yes, of course. And is it far better than what we've given patients previously, which is a Google search, them trying to call their cousin who studied biology, or whatever other pathway into the healthcare system, our broken healthcare system with troubled access that we have today? You know, yes, it is actually probably better. And so this is the alarmist use case that I like to get people in healthcare thinking about, where the tools are here today. We need to figure out how to get them into our system in a regulated way, in a way that people trust, as we're talking about. Because if we don't, consumers are going to go around us. And so we need to move quicker.
We'll close in academia. So I used to teach entrepreneurship as an adjunct at Syracuse University. Students are the best reflections of the world. I wish I should probably think about how I get back into adjuncting again. Generative is what you're going to be part of your course, I understand. And the thesis that anything can be dematerialized, that could be dematerialized, can now be modeled, and as a result could be generated. Protein is always the kind of like codfish example, right? 20 letters of the alphabet. You can do it. As you think about students and teaching generative, what is a data set that is easy to dematerialize, that has not been dematerialized as yet, right? Something that we just haven't digitized as yet, that you're super excited to see how it could be modeled and how it could be generative as you think about this new tool now that can generate from dematerialization of things.
Interesting, and I love the data questions. I'll say a couple of data sets where most students have started to play, which I think is exciting, is, in healthcare, and we're starting to see more of it, people are giving access to notes, giving access to all implementation tools like Mimic that have been putting out ICU data, vital signs, other things like this that just haven't been analyzed enough. And now, in a matter of hours, students can build up models and start to change and create new insights on data sets like this that are massive. And so from an academia perspective, one of the big pushes is, how do we just get more data sets like this out there and publish them and give access in the right way, so that students and kind of future researchers and people who are going to build the technology can get their start. And selfishly, but also I think my bias is get their start in healthcare, where they can see that impact that they can make, rather than going to work somewhere else that is much less exciting and impactful for human lives and moving things forward. And so those are just a couple of the data sets I would mention where people can start to play. Obviously, the genomic data is massive on where people can play, and I spend more time on the kind of clinical informatics side than I do on the pure kind of life sciences side of it from a data perspective. But there's just so much we can do there as well.
Okay, Richie, did you ever think that we would be able to talk about the Pharma Bro and Theranos in the same Chai episode?
No, this is one of my favorite episodes, and that's because Justin covers a lot of ground, right? So we were able to talk about the enterprise, we were able to talk about startups, we were able to talk about models, capital deployment, healthcare, non-healthcare, 20 years in the future, 2 years here, and that makes for interesting discussion. We talked about the Enron of AI. And the FICO score for every model, all in the same show. So super exciting. It's fascinating to have guests like these. What was one of the questions we never got to? Like, was there something that you wanted to ask him that we never got to?
Usually we spend a lot of time on cultural readiness, and we never really got there. But something came up in the discussion that really sparked my interest, that I think does speak to cultural readiness, and it is, we talk so much in AI about the data and the dirty data. And Justin really talked a lot about how, especially in healthcare, we're dealing with higher stakes data, higher stakes use cases. And now that we have had our eyes open about the power of what AI and generative AI can be doing in healthcare, all of a sudden, we're not thinking about, let's take all that dirty data and train these models. We're realizing that if we create a higher value asset, we can use that data asset to go after some of these use cases. So I think it's opened our eyes that maybe it's time to think about data in a slightly different way. And his insights about social determinants of health data and what that could unlock, our ability to tap into, say, a clinical note where a doctor has just had a chat with a patient and the patient talks about sort of how they grew up, where they grew up, and they realize that this is an important part of their health outcome. Fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Every time I think about the data conversation, I always remember the electric toothbrush, the connected toothbrush, the IoT toothbrush. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting use case and an interesting example. And I think we got to continue to ground ourselves in the usefulness of some of the things that we're thinking about. Because I'll tell you, I remember the first time I said to my dentist, there's going to be an IoT toothbrush and it'll send, data in real time. And old guy, great dentist. And he says to me, when you walk into my office and as soon as you open your mouth, within about 5 seconds, I know everything I need to know about you. I don't need your IoT data sent to me every day. It adds no value, right? So I think we're going to be in a situation where we're going to have to think about usefulness. Like, as usual, everybody's going to build an app for something, right? But the apps that are really going to make a dent are the ones that are the most useful. And so I'm excited to see how this evolves.